Wind Creek Casino and Hotel and WKRG News 5 present Honor Flight, South Alabama, a special hour.
Mobile Airport at 7 o'clock in the morning.
It's the start of a day that won't soon be forgotten. Once again, a U.S. Airways jetliner loaded with veterans of World War II is taking off from Mobile Regional Airport bound for Washington, D.C. and the World War II Memorial.
Hello, and thanks for joining us as we bring you stories of honor and sacrifice. Through our association with the people who made Honor Flight South Alabama possible, we're listening to the stories of the men and women who make up what's best been described as our greatest generation. When those who were lucky enough to survive came home from the war, they opted to go on with their life, their work, their families. Most didn't talk much about their experiences. Tonight you'll hear some of those almost lost stories and understand how ordinary men and women saved this country and others in an extraordinary effort that preserved our freedoms. We'll also take you along on the last great mission to bring honor and respect to this special group of people. Honor Flight, South Alabama.
I think it's a great experience I'll have.
I think it's a real fine thing that they're doing for World War II veterans.
I think it's great myself. There's a lot of people that from down here especially, that never been to Washington.
The plane ride from Mobile to Washington is made as easy as possible by Honor Flight volunteers.
And as we prepare to visit the monument that has been built and dedicated in their honor, we join together as a grateful nation to salute their patriotic sense of purpose and their commitment to service and duty.
For the vets, the Honor Flight journey began when they were much younger men and women, caught up in something that affected just about every man, woman, and child in the country, World War II. Over the past several months, we've talked with several veterans who found themselves fighting the Nazi enemy in Europe. They were infantrymen and tank drivers, pilots and prisoners, and everything in between. Jim Holloway and his brother Charles were among them. Jim actually joined the Air Force before the war began and served almost to the end of it. His first overseas deployment was supposed to be in the Pacific.
We left San Francisco the night of December the 6th of 1941. You know what happened in December the 7th.
Jim never made it to the Pacific. After some stateside deployments, he finally made it to Europe, crossing the Atlantic as a radio operator on a B-17. Jim Holloway would find himself dodging Nazi buzz bombs while stationed in England, and he would soon find out that his brother Charles was facing challenges of his own.
We would bomb the rail line. We would go in and fill in the craters.
Charles was ordered to do that by his German captors. He'd been an infantryman in Italy and France before being captured. He was assigned to Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Germany, near Munich. And despite being a prisoner, Charles believes he was fortunate since his captivity came close to the end of the war.
Like I said, I think the older guards knew the time was at an end for them, for the military. So they were very lenient. Like I say, they would allow the civilian women to come in with their bread.
Charles and 110,000 of his fellow prisoners were eventually liberated by the 14th Armored Division, who became known as the Liberators. At about the same time in Germany, a young infantryman, Harry Bennett, found himself in an unusual position as a tank driver with the 7th Armored Division. The division needed tanker replacements, and he volunteered.
Never driven a tank.
Right. How hard can it be?
But I was in the infantry. I said, "Hell, anything's better than the infantry."
And Bennett faced more challenges. At first, he didn't even know how to get into the Sherman tank he'd be driving. But with a little instruction, and since he'd driven heavy equipment before, Bennett believed he could do it, as long as it was daylight. His unit moved out at 1:45 a.m.
My heart sunk. I gave those fellows a ride they'll never forget, and I know they've prayed. If any of them are still alive, I'd like to meet them.
The division moved out in southern France, headed for Germany. It wasn't long before now veteran tank driver Bennett ran into the infamous Siegfried Line. The Germans built it to deter armored vehicles.
There's places that they have tank traps. The Siegfried Line, they had dragon's teeth, which were cement barriers.
But that's not all. A tank could literally be swallowed up into the ground.
A hole in the ground like the size of a house upside down. Once you're down in them, then you're stuck, see.
Bennett survived the armored spearhead into Germany and returned home, keeping his reserve status and training men for the Korean War.
These veterans are passing, or as I say, they're being promoted at the rate of about 12 to 1,500 a day.
I've got a wonderful feeling, everything's going my way. That's it. All right.
Their arrival at Reagan National Airport is met with cheers, tears, and gratitude. Busy airport travelers stop to pay tribute. There is music, an official military welcome. And there is Patty Pryor. She's met every honor flight in Washington since the program began.
The gentlemen deserve a lot more than what we give them now. And it's in my heart, it's their welcome home, it's their parade, and let them know how much we appreciate them.
Pryor, a veteran herself and a U.S. Airways employee, says she has a fondness for Honor Flight South Alabama. This past year, she traveled to the Gulf Coast for a visit. The Washington native had never been to Alabama before.
There are certain ones that are very special to me, and South Alabama is one of them because of the way they do treat the veterans. The veterans, you know, they all have smiles on their face when they get off that plane. And they're very happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
For many of the vets, the trip itself is a chance to reconnect with those who understand what the war and the time was all about. When they returned from their duties, many didn't talk about their jobs, some so dangerous an average person just wouldn't understand.
Well, finally ended up with 56 missions.
Charles Christie flew the P-47 Thunderbolt in missions over France. Most of those missions were dive bombing and strafing runs on strategic targets.
Shooting up anything that you could find moving, really. Trains, trucks, tanks, whatever.
Thunderbolt pilots would acquire targets at about 5,000 to 6,000 feet. There was a good reason for that.
That was in between where the rifle shots couldn't reach you and the anti-aircraft was usually above you. So you was kind of in between, so you was pretty safe at that altitude. A lot of times they wouldn't shoot at you coming down. They'd wait till you got started up and then they'd start shooting, and you could see the traces going all around. And you didn't want to fly in a straight line. You wanted to either move one way or another to try to dodge where they were shooting.
World War II combat pilots weren't known for long careers. Just ask Seeker Harris, who flew the B-17 and later the B-24 in bombing runs over Germany.
The B-24 is more maneuverable, right? More powerful, a little faster.
At times, hundreds of these bombers filled the skies as they rendezvoused and headed for their targets over Germany. On his 6th mission, Harris's plane was shot down, somewhere close to Munich. He and his crew bailed out and were captured by the Germans.
After I was first shot down, they put me in a room that was completely soundproof.
As an officer, Harris was kept in isolation and interrogated daily. He spent 15 months at Stalag 3 and lost some 69 pounds.
Still to come, you'll hear from men who fought in a pivotal battle deep in the heart of Germany and who witnessed the last days of the Nazi army. Plus, we'll take you along as these veterans arrive at their memorial in Washington.
Well, I tell you, it's just something that's it's just outstanding.
It's the moment these vets have waited for, the reason they are here.
Blows your mind. I had no idea how we would be received and thanked. Everybody comes up to you and shakes your hand, says thank you for your service. It gets you here.
The World War II Memorial honors the 16 million people who served in the armed forces during World War II and the 400,000 who paid the ultimate price. It honors men like Bob Middleton, whom we met on Honor Flight 5.
I'm gonna make you a star, Bob. Yeah.
Middleton fought at the pivotal battle for the last bridge still standing across the Rhine as the Allies marched toward Berlin.
The big battle to us was the Remagen Bridge.
Remagen. It's where Middleton says he almost met his match with a German sniper as he tried to spot him across the river with a pair of high-powered binoculars.
He came out there with his machine gun, and I could hear them coming. You could hear that funny sound the German machine guns made. And I dropped down the hole just in time he hit the top of my scope.
Middleton says he was almost there to witness another part of history, the fall of Berlin at the end of the war in Europe. But
the last 2 or 3 days before the fighting was over, they stopped us from going into Berlin. They had agreed with the Russians that they wouldn't go in. So we sat outside about 40 miles away.
Some vets did get to experience what they described as the best day of the war, the day it was over. Bob Gwynn was a 19-year-old gunner on a Stuart tank in Germany.
The day that I remember so much really was a 24-hour, 48-hour period. It was the day that all those Germans were coming in to surrender.
In fact, Gwynn ended up guarding the captured soldiers.
They were moving into these stockades in order to be interrogated and to determine who should be released and who should be retained. They were trying to, I gather, find the people who had committed the atrocities and things like that.
Gwynn was relieved the war in Europe had ended, but at the time it was not the end of his service.
We were still looking forward to possibly having to go to the Pacific.
Carrier forces attached to the greatest fleet on earth roam the waters off Japan and the Philippines.
Today their names are familiar with many: Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Okinawa, and many more. Small strips of land that dotted the vast Pacific Ocean, all stepping stones to the defeat of the Japanese imperial forces. And just like the war in Europe, there would be no victory without a heavy price.
And as we celebrate your trip here and place this wreath here at the column for those soldiers from Alabama that did not come home from World War II, we thank God for them and their service. We especially thank the Lord for you and yours and what you mean to our state and nation today. Thank you all.
At the moment, we are going ahead with our combined forces in the occupation of the Bonin Island of Iwo Jima.
Some of these veterans fought on the island of Iwo Jima, critical because of its lone airstrip. And one of those was Arthur Days, and he's here right now. You told me about the first night you spent on the island of Iwo Jima. Tell me about that.
The first night, when I got there, it was late in the evening, and I couldn't find my company. So a soldier told me, said, well, just dig a hole and get in it and stay in it overnight, and you'll be all right. I spent that whole night there, looking at traces going over my head.
Like many all-black companies during the war, Day's unit was put in a support role as stevedores loading ships bound for the war in the Pacific. His company landed with supplies to unload during the battle for Iwo Jima. Days says the sights of the island are burned into his memory.
When I looked down on the beach, and the Marines were being killed so fast they didn't have time to bury them. And they were they had them lined out on the beach, covered up on stretchers.
Days was one of 2.5 million African-American men who signed up for service during the war. But even with the racism and discrimination of the time, he said he learned something about people.
How sometimes we can get together, you know, and race differences disappear in the face of danger.
But having served his country, Days came home to a country that was far from colorblind. He dodged enemy bullets, but he still had to sit in the back of the bus on the way home from war.
We could fight, we could sacrifice together. But when I got back here, I couldn't even vote. That hurt.
Others brought home a different kind of hurt. As a Marine, Bobby Nix fought on 4 Pacific islands. He was wounded on 2 of them.
I was wounded on Saipan, and Iwo Jima both. I was hit twice in the leg here, and then once down here.
When Nix was wounded the first time on Saipan, he wasn't sent home. They just patched him up and got him ready for the next battle on Iwo Jima. He watched as the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi.
When the first flag was raised, it was too small. And we thought that the flag came down when the Japanese had re-attacked the guys up on top of Suribachi.
But that wasn't the case. Nix says when the bigger flag was raised, you could hear a cheer throughout the small island. At only 5 square miles, Iwo Jima made for close combat.
There was 22,000 Japanese and 20,000 of us. So, you know, we were pretty close together.
Still to come, Alabama state leaders pay tribute to these honor flight veterans. And a little later, meet some of the lady veterans who joined the effort to win the war.
And I said, this is about the waves. She said, I don't want you to go, but I'd go if I were you.
Welcome back to Honor Flight South Alabama, a special hour. There's always a different group of veterans to arrive at the World War II Memorial, but at the same time, there are the same people who are there to greet them after each flight.
I want to present this American flag that I had flown over the Capitol this morning in your honor. This flag represents you, and you represent the very best of America.
My parents were both World War II veterans, and they're both deceased. So in many ways, it gives me a chance on behalf of the people that I work for and represent, and the whole country really, to look into their eyes, but also to see my mom and dad, and to thank them for the kind of sacrifice that really is rarely seen these days.
Very good.
Senators Jeff Sessions and Richard Shelby and Representative Joe Bonner welcome each Honor Flight South Alabama to the nation's capital. Each time, Bonner presents a proclamation at the Alabama column of the World War II Memorial.
I want to present a statement that I entered into the congressional record today.
For a lot of these vets, this trip is about striking up new relationships with colleagues they didn't even know during the war. And for others, it's a chance to rekindle some old friendships.
We're crew members together.
Is that right?
Yeah.
JR was the pilot, I was the right gunner. We put 25 missions in together. And, well, just recounting all the things that happened.
Guys, did you know each other were going to be here today?
Yes, oh yes. JR told me he was going to come up with the honor flight, and I said,
from New Jersey.
I said, I'll make damn sure I get down to see it. This might be our last mission together.
Right.
This is the B-29, the plane you've been waiting for.
J.R. Elliott flew the B-29 bomber over the Pacific during the war. While dodging the not-so-friendly Japanese aircraft, Elliott says he was shot down by friendly fire after a case of mistaken identity.
You know, he bailed out once. He was shot down by the British.
He told me that story.
Oh, did he?
He told me he was shot down by the British.
I can't believe that story.
Well, it happened. I remember because I did it.
Convoy en route to Port Moresby. Troop ships in the Coral Sea with Americans and Australians bound for secret bases in New Guinea.
According to those who were there, the Pacific was a different kind of war, with a different kind of enemy.
The Japanese fighting forces were so fanatical. They had no value of death whatsoever.
Ken Crampton had been trained as a combat engineer to build bridges, but to his surprise, he was sent to the Pacific where few bridges were needed. He drew the task of rooting out Japanese soldiers from their underground spaces on Pacific islands.
And on some of those islands where they had time to fortify them underground, like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, well, they had everything underground, sleeping quarters, hospitals.
Crampton served at the Battle for Okinawa, but he also served on another small Pacific island, Aishimi, about 6 miles from Okinawa. He was there at the same time that famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed.
Somebody put a picture in the paper, and everybody picked up on it here a few years back, showed him laying on the side of the road like he was abandoned.
Crampton says that wasn't the case.
The engineers built a nice monument showing the 77th Division insignia. And everybody was assembled, and we gave him an honored burial.
There were others who rubbed shoulders with history makers. Bill Ferguson was a young Marine corporal stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. It's the same ship that launched a daring attack of B-25 bombers toward Tokyo, a squadron commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle.
I was working for the captain when he came. That's when he introduced me to him and told him, he said, this fellow will do anything you want. He'll take you anywhere on the ship you want to go. And he told me to do it, and I said, yes, sir.
Doolittle planned the daring bombing raid on Tokyo, a mission about which several movies have been made. It involved specifically outfitted B-25 bombers that could take off from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done. 16 hand-picked crews trained for only a couple of months to pull off the mission. Ferguson says they were VIPs on the Hornet.
He was given anything he wanted, and his men were too.
Ferguson watched those B-25s take off, destined for Japan, and crash landings in China. Afterward, the Hornet was off on other missions to Guadalcanal and New Caledonia, where a Japanese bomber took its toll. Ferguson and a buddy manned dual 20mm guns and fired at the plane.
I remember one plane coming down shooting machine gun bullets all around. When the bomb hit on me and sprayed me and all, it just slammed me on the deck.
Bill Ferguson was transferred to a hospital ship to treat his injuries, but his buddy was killed.
Bill Ferguson certainly isn't the first sailor to experience the sensation of having a ship shot out from under him. And many of the ships gained fame during the war because of the damage they sustained during battle and some of the great battles they were in. The Enterprise, Yorktown, Saratoga, all aircraft carriers, the backbone of the fleet. Among them also was the USS Lexington.
Real good. I ain't never been treated this good, you know.
Bernard Duffy was recently on the honor flight, but long before that, he was an original crew member aboard the Navy's premier aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington. The Japanese called her the Blue Ghost because it was the only ship in the fleet not camouflaged. Duffy was just feet from the torpedo explosion that almost sank her.
I was right in the middle of where the hole was, and it turned me for about 3 flips, and it messed my knees up.
During the 12-hour battle in the Marshall Islands, the Lexington endured relentless attacks from enemy aircraft.
We shot out about 360 Jap aircraft during that 12-hour period. Well, I counted 11 torpedoes that night. Some of them went under the ship, some went in front, some went in back.
But it only took one to cripple the ship with a 60-foot gash in her starboard side. The Lexington limped to port for repairs. But after his year on the ship, Duffy found himself in yet another hot spot in a naval support group on the island of Iwo Jima. He is one more in only a small group of Gulf Coast vets to witness the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi.
When the sergeant come down from the top of it, he told me, he said, I took 263 men up that mountain. 26 of them walked down. That's how many was shot up there. That flag raising cost them a lot of men.
As the Pacific War raged, the surface ships like the Lexington fought back bombers, kamikazes, and torpedoes. Beneath the surface, the U.S. was engaged in its own silent war, and Wally Sabin was at the heart of it.
In the first patrol we made, first two patrols, we sunk 29,000 some tons.
And if he had to do it over again, Sabin says it would be on a submarine. Sabin says he tried to enlist in the Navy for submarine service out of high school, but he was told he was too short.
And then I talked to my family doctor. He says, Wally, you just lay on the floor for a few months and stretch out at night. And that's what I did.
And it worked. When he went back, they took him off to sometimes grueling physical and mental training to be on submarines, training where many washed out. He was finally put on a boat, just like the USS Drum at Battleship Park. The very nature of a submarine is to operate undetected, and Sabin got very close to the enemy in the Sea of Japan.
Made a patrol on that. We rescued a pilot that was, you could see the shore, how close to the shore we were when we picked him up and got out of there. We fired on by shore batteries and stuff like that.
Well, submarines have long been romanticized by some, but there's another naval vessel that is also somewhat exotic. It was fast and it was dangerous, and according to at least one vet, somewhat glamorous.
The PT boat, small vessels surprisingly made of heavily reinforced plywood hulls. They were made famous by President John F. Kennedy's service on them, and Ken Marshall served aboard PT 237 in the South Pacific.
We patrolled the Solomons, New Guinea, Palau.
Marshall says the PTs patrolled only at night. He says, in fact, the only time his boat got hit was when they patrolled in the daylight, so they stopped doing that. The PTs were fast and lethal, but Marshall dispels the myth that they were glamorous.
It's kind of like submarines. You say you're on a submarine, man, that's glamorous. PTs are glamorous, but they were just a small boat with a whole lot of guns on them.
When we come back, meet some of the women who put off family life for a while to better serve their country. And a little bit later, they're the stars of a generation. And for at least one night, they're the stars of South Alabama. Welcome back to Honor Flight South Alabama, a special hour. There were many women who played important roles during the war. Whether they were nurses or WACs or waves, they held down many, many different jobs and were a huge part of the effort.
Today, the WACs are serving with the armed forces in every major theater of war.
And it wasn't just military service. Women mobilized to meet every challenge, gaining new skills and new opportunities.
All day long, with rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the revenue keeps shining.
For many, meeting the challenge led to life-changing experiences. Mary Hirschfeld was something new for the Navy during World War II. Women. With so many men needed to fight the war, a lot of jobs were left undone. That's where separate organizations like the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or WACs, or the Navy's Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, or WAVES, helped.
They wanted people to take over the jobs that men were doing so they could, bless them, go and serve.
Hirschfeld was one of some 80,000 WAVES at the height of the war. With a degree in home economics, she was exactly the kind of person the Navy looked for. They sent her to boot camp in New York and a station at Navy Barracks in Daytona Beach. She was also a member of the Shore Patrol, the Navy's police force.
It was quite a great experience because you met girls from all over.
It wasn't the first time the Navy enlisted women to help. Decades earlier, in World War I, enlisted women were called yeomen, filling mostly secretarial and clerical jobs. But during the Second World War, their jobs were expanded to include aviation and intelligence, among others. Hirschfeld's tour lasted until they learned the war in Europe had ended.
We celebrated. That was a real celebration because we knew then that it wasn't going to be that long.
Mary, what brand? Waves.
The Waves.
Waves.
Go Navy, beat Army.
Navy here.
Go Navy, beat Army.
Mary Bouch shared with us the day she told her parents she'd joined the Navy.
And I showed them the papers, and immediately my mother had tears in her eyes. And she came over and hugged me. And I said, "This is about the waves." She said, "I don't want you to go, but I'd go if I were you."
And off she went to boot camp at Hunter College in the Bronx, New York, Yeoman School in Oklahoma, then to her assignment in the heart of war decision-making, Washington, D.C.
We had very little knowledge of what the enemy planes looked like.
Her post was at the Technical Air Intelligence Office. Their job was to solve a very serious problem.
Our people were getting shot down too fast.
So the Navy took action. They mounted cameras on their own combat planes. As aerial battles commenced, pictures were being taken.
Send those pictures back to us. We'd sort them out to see which plane it was. We had names for them. I knew the Bettys and the Zeeks and all of those.
Bouch was the latest woman veteran to travel aboard Honor Flight South Alabama. A fellow veteran urged her to apply.
He was so thrilled with what happened that day. He said, "Mary, have you sent in your application yet?" And I had by that time. And he said, "It's a day you'll never forget."
Mary Bouch's job was just one important way women answered the call to war. Helen Pearson would end up holding another important position. She was absolutely sure she would be making a contribution during the war.
I wanted to go in the service. I wanted to be an MP. They said no.
At the time, she didn't know how her service to her country would affect her the rest of her life. She ended up at a headquarters unit for a message center at Buckingham Army Airfield in Florida. She helped send and receive classified and unclassified messages for the Army. It's where the Army also trained gunners to serve on B-17 bombers.
They were in the most dangerous thing. Being in that bubble on that B-17, and the pilot and the navigators, they would come down there and outfit the B-17 and take the gunners with them. And when they went by, our prayers were with them because we knew their life would be very short.
But that wasn't all Pearson would find at the base where she served. She would also find her future husband.
My husband was the acting sergeant major of the field.
Helen and Rudy Pearson were married the day after the D-Day invasion and continued serving together. Rudy Pearson passed away in 2001, but it was actually his memory that prompted Helen to go on Honor Flight 4. Her daughters arranged for him to be there too.
Joe Barner was there, and I said, "What's going on?" And Laurie said, "Nothing, Mother, he just wants you there." The next thing I know, Joe Barner was presenting me with a flag for my husband. Now, if you don't think that was a shock. He's with us, spiritually.
Honor Flight proved to be quite a memorable experience for two other women veterans. Not only do they live on the Gulf Coast, they shared the same job while serving during World War II and had never met each other before the flight. Aileen Woods and Jane Blanchford were already nurses when they signed up for the Army toward the end of the war.
And of course, all the non-columns did not like it because we were given a commission the minute we signed up. But Uncle Sam said he needed 65,000 nurses, and I figured I could be one of those.
After basic training, she served at a North Carolina hospital that specialized in pulmonary diseases, and there was plenty of that from soldiers who served in the Pacific, especially tuberculosis.
And they were so consumed with tuberculosis that we did not look to see how much TB they had. We looked to see how much lung they had left to work with.
For Blatchford, a senior nurse at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indiana, she treated the wounded returning from one of the bloodiest battles of the war, D-Day.
3 days after D-Day, we had our first patients. Can you imagine? Today it would be nothing, but back then, 3 days from Europe with wounded patients.
And both women were involved in what back then must have been a true medical miracle, the first experimental use of penicillin. It replaced maggots as a standard treatment for infected wounds. While both had lived on the Gulf Coast for many years, they didn't know each other until recently, the day they flew on Honor Flight South Alabama.
Then getting together with all these veterans on this flight was absolutely one of the most wonderful experiences I ever had.
And given that they worked so closely between life and death, it was no surprise the most memorable part of the trip was laying a wreath on the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery.
Well, I still have to swallow hard. Probably the greatest honor I've ever had in my life.
Stay with us. When we come back, you'll find out how Honor Flight South Alabama came to happen in the first place and meet some of the people who make it happen. They're called Guardians.
These guys and gals get a hold of your heartstrings.
The memorial's breathtaking.
These are scenes from This Is Honor Flight, a video produced for the Honor Flight Network and featuring its co-founder, Earl Morris.
We're racing against a clock. In another 5 to 7 years, it'll be a moot point. They will be gone.
Sadly, our nation did not build that memorial until 2004 and 5. Those guys were all in their 80s and 90s, and by that time it was really a daunting task financially, physically, to try to get to Washington.
The Honor Flight Network began in 2005 when Morse, a physician's assistant in the Air Force, was treating World War II veterans in Springfield, Ohio. While he asked the veterans if they were going to see the newly built memorial, it became clear they had limitations. Morse, also a pilot, flew the first handful of veterans to Washington in private planes, but the applications and interest in the program skyrocketed.
This is probably the last chapter of their lives, and for some, it's literally the last paragraph of their lives.
Honor flights began all across the country, and in 2008, Spanish Fort dentist and Vietnam veteran Dr. Barry Booth went on his first honor flight.
I had the privilege of being recruited as a guardian in 2008 by the Prattville River Ridge honor flight, and Dr. Ed Mullins, my best friend, good friend, dental classmate.
For Honor Flight South Alabama, a core group of veterans and veteran advocates climbed on board, and Dr. Booth is their quarterback.
I call him the prime mover. He's the driver behind everything. What you got to understand about Dr. Booth is so completely invested, and I mean in everything in his being, and emotionally invested. Dr. Booth knows every veteran that we've ever taken, and it's over 450 now. He knows them personally.
Since it began, Booth has spent hours talking up the program to community groups, city councils, and radio and television audiences. But he prefers to spread the credit for the success of the program to others.
It was not difficult at all because of when you have a group like Colonel Downing, Commander Ream, Ms. Coley, and Colonel New. All of us know our part. All of us take care of our responsibilities. No one has to look over their shoulder.
And it's fitting that an organization run by military veterans is run with military precision.
I need to fill in all the way up in here.
I think also, since most of us were prior military, then the military planning and operational aspects kind of kicked in. So we run it like a military operation, and I'm sure a lot of other honor flights do the same way.
Former Army Colonel Pat Downing is in charge of what Dr. Booth says is the most important aspect of making honor flights successful. Guardians are those hand-picked volunteers who accompany each veteran to make sure they stay safe during the trip.
These veterans are entrusted to us by their family members, and we get calls from daughters and grandchildren and saying, is my dad or is my mom, is it really going to be safe? And we have to let them know that we're going to take care of them just like they were family, because we don't want anything to happen to them. Because a fall or where a person might break their hip could be a death sentence for someone in their 80s and 90s. And so we take care of them just like their family.
Days before the actual honor flight, guardians who may also be family members of veterans or just volunteers who have joined the cause get a full day of training.
We have the slideshow, and where we show them all the locations that we'll be visiting on that day, and also the necessary safety steps that they have to take at those locations, like where steps are, where a ramp is, where the bathrooms are, and so forth.
Guardians even learn about what they may consider simple things, like how to use a wheelchair. Several extra wheelchairs are taken along on the trip, even though some of the veterans may think they won't need one. But the day is a long one, and the honor flight leaders and guardians encourage their use if a vet thinks he needs one.
We take approximately 40 extra wheelchairs on the trip because we found that although some of the veterans are very healthy and can walk, by the time we spend a couple hours at the World War II Memorial and we get over to the Lincoln Memorial where we can visit the Vietnam Memorial or the Korean War Memorial, we find that some of the veterans may tire.
Colonel Downing says we take all these extra wheelchairs along because, as I indicate to them, the ladies love veterans in wheelchairs. I want a wheelchair.
Colonel Downing's motto is "No vet left behind," and that responsibility falls on the shoulders of former Navy Commander Pete Ream.
And I'm sort of, I guess you call it the sweeper. Colonel Downing, he's the lead, he's the nose, he goes first into everything, and I bring up the rear. And, you know, just making sure that there's no stragglers, there's nobody's left behind, because sometimes it gets a little complicated. A guardian sometimes has 2 or 3 veterans, and if, you know, one of them has to get into a wheelchair because he tires out, he needs help. So we have somebody in the back to make sure we don't leave anybody behind, and we do counts all the way.
So far, that plan has worked flawlessly, with the exception of a vet or two getting on the wrong bus. But that's where the colored T-shirts of the vets come into play.
Forget which one of them was Honor Flight 3. We were over at the Lincoln Memorial Park, and I see a couple buses behind us. I see 3 gold T-shirts get on a bus, and I run back there, and I get on that bus, and I think everybody else had orange T-shirts on. I said, fellas, unless you're deciding to go to Cleveland today, you need to get off and come with us.
So far, there's been no lack of volunteers to act as guardians for the veterans. In fact, Honor Flight South Alabama has the distinction of having the only governor volunteer to be a guardian. Former Governor Bob Riley was on Honor Flight 4. While it's a special day for the vets, in many cases the day is just as special for those watching over them. Aaron Daniels has been a guardian on all of the Honor Flight South Alabama trips. He says for those who have yet to make the trip as a guardian,
I would tell them that it would be an experience that they would never forget, and it'd probably be one of the most special experiences that they ever have.
The icing on the cake for Honor Flight South Alabama is yet to come, for the veterans and for their families.
Welcome back. Well, as you've heard, the Honor Flight South Alabama Day is a pretty long one for these vets. There's a lot that's packed into it. But no matter how tired they are, all of that's taken away when they arrive back home at Mobile Regional Airport, and they're treated like the stars that they are.
At mail call, Americans overseas receive their letters.
Before the wheels touch down at Mobile Regional Airport, returning Honor Flight veterans are treated to something that everyone who has ever been in the service looks forward to: mail call.
On the way back, on the flight on the way back, each veteran gets a packet of letters that has been written by school children from Baldwin County and Mobile County.
All of them personalized to each veteran. It's just one more thing these veterans will take with them from this day.
These letters, I don't know how many times I read the letters that I had from school children. It's just a feeling you get, like my wife said, I'm married, 64 years now, and she has never seen me cry until I start reading those letters and on this trip, coming back on this trip.
And it's just one more in a series of surprises that makes the Honor Flight South Alabama trip even more special. When arriving in Washington and arriving back home, firefighters raise the flag between ladder trucks to greet the flight. The veterans are also treated to a water cannon salute, usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or retiring airline pilots. And then there is one more event to cap off an eventful day. Family and friends gather at Mobile Regional Airport, anxiously awaiting the return of their veteran.
Well, he was sent overseas and went to the Philippines. And he was one of them that was sitting in the boats ready to go to Japan when they dropped the bomb and they surrendered. So he probably got his life saved by doing that.
I haven't really heard too many of stories, but I think he's going to start telling me now that he's gone on this trip. So
Mobile's Margaret Coley, one of the Corps Honor Flight leaders, coordinates each Welcome Home event.
The organization that Mrs. Coley puts together with regard to school kids, families, friends, football teams, church choirs, bands, when they show up at the Mobile Airport, these veterans can't believe it.
And News 5's Mel Showers is on hand to talk with and salute them.
We had a good time. Thank you.
Quick, what did you think of today?
Oh, it was marvelous. I enjoyed it a lot. Real tired, but it's worth it.
And what did you think of seeing this big crowd when you returned?
I couldn't believe it. That's a big turnout.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Everything went off like clockwork. Just a perfect day all the way.
Along with families and friends greeting them, fellow vets, including 2 lady veterans who flew on separate honor flights, greet each other. It is a celebration they will have with them for the rest of their lives. It's the celebration that many of them missed when they returned from the greatest conflict this country ever saw.
That welcome home, that victory lap, that ticker tape parade that they get at the Mobile Airport is lasting in their thoughts.
And now, along with the memory of their collective effort that changed the course of the history of a nation, a world, they have one more story to tell.
Well, certainly myself and all of us who are veterans have lived a dream, and given proper thought, we can reflect back and see that the victory, the perseverance, the prevailing atmosphere of World War II, of these veterans coming home, securing our freedoms and the liberties that we have, unbelievable. So I have lived the dream, and when I look at these gentlemen and ladies and know what they've done, know what they gave up, we are all grateful for that. And we could not consider it an ever more a privilege to be able to have Honor Flight South Alabama.
Wind Creek Casino and Hotel and WKRG News 5 present Honor Flight South Alabama, a special hour.